reading what's going on in YouTube, which is really magnificent, as well as listening to all of you, one of the thoughts that occurred to me is that repetition is not duplication. And I think it makes sense to separate those two concepts, especially in Stein, but in general, when you listen to modern jazz, when you look at abstract art, to repeat is not to duplicate, because I could say the same phrase over and over again, but I'll never say it exactly the same way, with exactly the same breath, and even potentially with exactly the same emphasis. And so perhaps when looking at Stein and her repetition, we think upon it as a repetition as progression, not repetition as standstill.
You're absolutely right. And I think in one way, she gets this from her interest in William James' pragmatism, which is really dealing with this question. And we have been known in ModPo to talk about tender buttons in exactly this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play, 25 seconds or something of Stein's portrait of Picasso. This is the famous he, and he segment. And then Lainey is going to lead us in a conversation, and I'm going to ask Jason, Erika, Kinar, and Mandana to participate in responding to Lainey. Okay, here goes.
He, and he, and he, and he, and he, and he, and as he, and as he, and he. He is, and as he is, and as he is, and he is. He is, and as he, and he, and as he is, and he, and he, and he, and he.
Wow! There's a lot of he's there. Lainey, take it away. Let's see what we can do with this.
All right. So, some questions. I'm really curious what you think about the word he in these lines. And more specifically, what's happening sonically, tonally, rhythmically, in terms of meaning, and then in terms of repetition, which we just talked about. And there's a question of number, how many he's. So anywhere you want to go with any of that.
Beautiful. Jason, you want to start?
I think that in that passage, there is a sound of laughter and there's a multiplicity of he's. And in the poem, we only get two names, but
what are the two names? We get Charles the First.
If we think of Picasso, he's
and Picasso.
Always changing style. He's always in a different period. And I think that it makes me think of, in relation to the previous question and this, that Stein, I think it's important to remember that Stein, in her youth and young adulthood, was obsessed with evolution. Like Dave said, she's an evolutionary anthropologist, that she was obsessed with evolution, and thus I was in Darwin, and was at medical school, where she did things like over and over again dissecting different embryos. And I think that in relation to the last passage and this passage, there's a proliferation of possible selves. In the last Unloving Repeating, I think has to do with, if we think of her looking at an embryo and thinking that everyone starts this way, and that in a way we are all repetitions in variation from one another. And that is the variation that generates evolution. That from that, there is not only individual selves, but there's selves present in every present moment. So to name someone or to pronoun someone is always a fallacy. It only makes sense to say it the way she's saying it here, because there's an infinite succession of Picassos and Napoleons and each of us in each present moment. So that's my take.
That's beautiful.
Wow, amazing. I love the connection to science here and repetition, and it makes me think about how there's very few things that only happen once, right? Like you're born once. Well, not metaphorically, but most, like all the good things require repetition, right? You're hungry and you eat, but then you're going to get hungry again. Or if you enjoy talking to a person, you don't want to never talk to them again. You want to repeat. You know, if you want to write a poem, you want to write another poem. So that's really eloquently stated, the infinite succession of Picassos and Napoleons. Thank you, Jason. So next we go to Erika.
So this is a moment in If I Told Him that's striking, because If I Told Him has such tiny lines, with the exception of some of these moments like the one that Lainey read, where you get this he, and he, and he, and he, and it kind of spreads across the page in a way where it almost feels like, as a reader, you sort of are like, oh, wow, am I getting a complete sentence? Actually, no, I'm not. So there's that aspect of things that I'm thinking about, which seems to be jiving with what Jason was saying about like this continuous unfolding. I'm also wondering if this is a moment where Stein is doing a couple of things at once, one being that this is a word portrait and she's doing something sonically to celebrate her friend, right? So you get this certain rhythm of the pronoun that's slightly different from the rest of the poem. I also can't help but wonder if she's doing something around commenting on power and, you know, kind of refusing something she says in the title, tongue-in-cheek, the idea of a completed portrait. She's refusing the completed portrait. She's refusing a grammatically complete sentence. And the repetition of he, for me as a reader, almost minimizes the pronoun itself, and it begins to dissolve into the line as it grows across the page. So that's something that I would add.
Wow, that's fantastic. This idea of the pronoun over and over dissolving. And I love how you're talking about simultaneity here, which seems absolutely true. The sonic celebration, but also the diss, right? And the how do we interpret the laughter? You know, ha ha ha. No, it's he he he. Sorry, that would have been a different line.
Well, it's close to ha ha ha.
Right, that could have happened, but she didn't choose to go there. But I love holding those two in mind, and then it's also kind of left up for us to interpret the laughter. Like she's laughing at him and celebrating him. So if we were in the room, I don't know, the recording helps so much, but if we were physically in the room, maybe there would be even more to say about the simultaneity of what's inside the laughter. That's complicated. Thank you for taking us there, Erika. Next, we go to Kanar.
I don't know, especially listening to Stein read these lines, I feel like there's just this really kind of lilting, bobbing aspect to the language and to the movement. Almost like the ands as well are kind of functioning differently. It's almost like sometimes a he or a he is sort of actually something that's bounded over by the and to get to the other and. I think because there's something a little more firm there in that kind of and kind of gives a launch point just as a kind of speaker, as a reader, right? So that was fascinating to hear, and I think it also kind of contributed to this almost abolition, of this sort of gendered pronoun, where, you know, Picasso never really gets fully inscribed in the he, and there is something just much more playful, I think, at work.
Amazing. It's amazing how much is right here. So I really appreciate that you're pointing to the physicality it's so physical, right? Like this poem, and we see it when we watch the dance or we listen to the DJ Spooky that's in the video with Erica and Kristen and Al and on teaching. You can almost start to think of the repetition as physical movement and gesture, and you can feel the rhythm and the music of it physically. So you said lilting, bobbing, and then the and is so important. I feel like the and is also pointing to the breath work that we hear in her reading. And in any kind of movement, we all know, right? The and is like, and one, like an inhalation, and then the movement, right?
So it's also iambic. It returns to some kind of poetic convention briefly.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's turn to Mandana. Mandana, are you still there?
So many smart things have been said here. The first thing I was thinking about is something you just talked about, Lenny. There's the simplicity of the fact that these are all one-syllable words. These are the things you teach a baby when a baby starts talking. Even the ma and the pa, it's all one-syllable words. And from that, there's something that is so robust and rich and complex. But there's initially really a democratization, the foreign persons tried to say that word, of the syllables. And so that you have a choice of where you can land and where you can emphasize. But one thing that I was thinking about when you were all talking is I couldn't translate this poem to Persian because we don't have gendered pronouns. And that kind of struck me that, wow, this is very much an English poem, or a poem of a sort where gender is at least a word, if not a meaning. And I kept thinking, well, how would I translate this? And I still have no idea. And just finally, I love what Erica had to say. I always love what Erica has to say. And I thought, what if, excuse me, you hear New York City noises, what if each he was a different color of blue? If we made this into a portrait, it would not all be the same blue. So to consider kind of the multicolored aspect of just two words being repeated again and again, it isn't the same color, and it could never be the same color each time that you say it.
This is such a great, astonishingly coherent, hour so far talking about Stein, because what you just said goes back to some things we've been saying about sameness is difference, repetition is never the same thing, it's not duplication, etc.